In the isolated hills of eastern Oregon, buried underneath generations of deliberate secrecy, rests a reality so disturbing that regional officials kept it hidden for more than 100 years. Throughout the period from 1852 to 1888, over 800 travelers disappeared along a 20-mile segment of the Oregon Trail. These weren't deaths from illness, nor were they accidental. Something far more malevolent was at work. The Sacred Heart Chapel, a simple wooden building that offered spiritual comfort to exhausted pioneers, functioned in reality as the center of the most organized mass murder operation in the history of the American frontier. What started as random disappearances evolved into a family operation so deliberate, so ruthlessly systematic, that it transformed our understanding of human depravity. The Grayson family didn't simply take lives for financial gain. They elevated it to a refined practice, maintaining detailed accounts of each person they eliminated, every household they destroyed, every aspiration they interred in unmarked plots. Before we descend into the shadow that enveloped the Grayson family and those they murdered, I must ask something from you. This content isn't meant for everyone, exclusively for those willing to face the most unsettling realities concealed within America's history. If you're among those who can handle these dark revelations, hit subscribe right now and drop a comment letting me know which state you're tuning in from. Your backing enables us to reveal the narratives that others won't speak of. Let's now travel back to 1852, when the Oregon Trail represented aspiration yet delivered terror. The Oregon Trail extended like a vital connection across the American wilderness, transporting dreams westward across 2,000 miles of harsh landscape. For the countless families who liquidated all their possessions for an opportunity at fresh starts, each mile embodied both expectation and danger. Illness, starvation, and natural disasters took innumerable lives. But within the undulating hills of eastern Oregon, death took on a different form. One that beamed with religious compassion while assessing the worth of a household's belongings. The year 1852 represented the height of Oregon Trail migration, with over 50,000 individuals undertaking the dangerous voyage west. When most wagon groups finally reached Oregon's Blue Mountains, they had already covered approximately 1,800 miles. Families were worn out. Provisions were running scarce, and the most vulnerable members often fell victim to trail fever, dysentery, and other conditions that transformed dreams of success into desperate battles for existence. It was within this setting of weakness that Father Murray Grayson founded the Sacred Heart Chapel in 1851. The weathered timber structure rested on a hill overlooking a natural resting place beside the trail, a spot where exhausted travelers often paused to give their oxen rest and inter their deceased. For passing pioneers, the chapel represented heavenly intervention, a light of optimism in the wasteland where they could find spiritual comfort and, if necessary, dignified Christian burial for their departed. Father Murray, a tall, thin man in his 40s with piercing gray eyes and a voice that demanded respect, had entered Oregon territory, asserting he was a traveling minister. He spoke persuasively about his mission to tend to the spiritual requirements of westward moving families, and his familiarity with Scripture appeared authentic enough to persuade even the most doubtful travelers. At his side was his dedicated spouse, who went by Sister Constance, a woman whose soft disposition and apparent medical expertise made her essential to families dealing with unwell children and perishing relatives. Brother Ezekiel, Murray's younger brother, rounded out the trio that would become identified with both deliverance and damnation. While Murray had the commanding presence of an inherent leader, Ezekiel handled the practical matters, talented with his hands, knowledgeable about animals, and constantly prepared to assist struggling families mend their wagons or care for their livestock. Collectively, the three created an image of Christian kindness that pulled desperate families like insects to a flame. The chapel itself was unpretentious but properly cared for, constructed from regional timber featuring a small graveyard beside the main structure. Inside, roughly made wooden benches faced a plain altar decorated with a wooden cross that Murray claimed to have made personally. The building's most notable characteristic was its remarkably large cellar, which the Graysons explained as essential storage for provisions they kept available to assist needy travelers. The neighboring community was thin, a few scattered homesteads and a small trading post roughly 15 miles east. This seclusion served the Graysons effectively, since it meant fewer observers to their operations and reduced possibility of outside involvement. Local inhabitants who had encountered the family generally spoke favorably of them, commending their kindness and religious commitment. After all, who else would devote their existence to tending to perishing strangers in such a remote location? What rendered the Graysons particularly successful was their grasp of the trail's harsh realities. They recognized that when families reached their location, many would be coping with severe illness, diminishing supplies, and the mental exhaustion resulting from months of difficulty. They presented themselves as the solution to these challenges. Not just spiritual leaders, but practical assistants who could offer medical attention, provisions, and even short-term housing for families too feeble to press on right away. The matter of religious affiliation rarely appeared significant to desperate families. Regardless of whether they were Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, or any other Protestant faith, the Graysons adjusted their method accordingly. Marai was knowledgeable in different Protestant traditions and could cite scripture in whatever style most comforted his listeners. This adaptability proved essential on the frontier, where religious differences frequently became secondary to basic survival. The initial recorded disappearance happened on September 23, 1852. Although investigators wouldn't reconstruct the timeline until much later, the Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 small children, and Elizabeth's elderly father had been journeying with a wagon train that had broken up upon reaching Oregon Territory. Like many families, they chose to press forward alone toward their ultimate destination, certain they could cover the remaining distance without the protection of a larger party. When the Morrisons' wagon suffered a broken axle just 2 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel, it appeared like heavenly intervention. James Morrison would later be quoted in territorial records as stating the chapel materialized like a present from the Creator when he saw it from the ridge where his wagon had failed. Brother Ezekiel, who seemed to possess an extraordinary ability to materialize precisely when travelers most required assistance, arrived at the damaged wagon within hours of the accident. Brother Ezekiel said in his deliberate, measured cadence that would become his signature, "The Lord has positioned you near our modest chapel for a purpose. Sister Constance has delivered numerous babies, and your Elizabeth appears ready to give birth any day now. Father Marai would deem it an honor to offer shelter while you fix your wagon and prepare for this blessed arrival." The Morrison family appreciatively accepted the offer, moving into the small cabin next to the chapel that the Graysons kept available for exactly such situations. For 3 days, everything appeared completely ordinary. Sister Constance looked after Elizabeth with tender attention. Brother Ezekiel helped James with the wagon fixes, and Father Marai gave spiritual consolation to the worried family. The youngsters played in the chapel yard while Elizabeth's father, Samuel, rested his arthritic bones in the cabin's comfortable rocking chair. On the 4th day, circumstances started to shift. Elizabeth's father was the initial one to become ill, reporting intense stomach pain and queasiness. Sister Constance attributed it to trail sickness, a general expression for the various conditions that affected travelers, and started giving what she called sacred treatments that she made from herbs and other components stored in the chapel's cellar. "The Lord provides healing through nature's abundance," she would say while mixing her preparations. But sometimes the body must eliminate toxins before recovery can commence. Within hours of consuming Sister Constance's medicine, Samuel's condition deteriorated significantly. His complexion turned an ashen shade. His breathing grew labored, and he started experiencing severe episodes of vomiting and diarrhea. James Morrison, becoming alarmed, inquired whether they should seek help from the trading post to the east. But Father Marai advised patience. "Brother James," the preacher said, placing a comforting hand on the younger man's shoulder, "I have witnessed this illness repeatedly on the trail. It must run its course. Moving Samuel now would certainly kill him. We must have faith in God's timing and Sister Constance's healing abilities." By the 6th day, young Tommy Morrison, age 7, started displaying similar symptoms, then his sister Mary, age 5. Sister Constance worked tirelessly, creating more treatments, providing what she called cleansing therapies, and maintaining watch over the increasingly ill family members. To James and Elizabeth, still healthy but exhausted from looking after their loved ones, the woman seemed like a holy figure sent by God to assist them through their hardship. The reality was far more sinister. The blessed remedies that Sister Constance gave with such apparent commitment contained carefully measured portions of arsenic, which the Graysons had learned could be obtained from nearby mining operations under the pretense of rodent control. The symptoms, the stomach cramps, nausea, skin discoloration, and eventual organ failure, perfectly replicated those of various trail illnesses, making the killings almost impossible to detect by grieving relatives who had already witnessed so much death and suffering throughout their journey west. Samuel Morrison died on the 7th day, followed by Tommy on the 9th and Mary on the 11th. Each passing came with elaborate Christian ceremonies performed by Father Murray, who spoke movingly about the deceased joining their Heavenly Father and finding peace after their earthly suffering. The remaining family members, shattered by sorrow but thankful for the Graysons' spiritual support, never questioned the rapid sequence of deaths. After all, entire families were known to have succumbed to disease on the trail. What they didn't realize was that each night after the grieving survivors had worn themselves out with weeping and prayer, Brother Ezekiel would methodically search through the family's belongings, creating thorough lists of everything valuable. The Morrisons had been fairly well off back in Missouri, and their wagon contained quality furniture, good tools, family treasures, and a significant quantity of gold coins that James had sewn into secret pockets within his clothing. On the 12th day, James Morrison himself started showing the characteristic symptoms. Elizabeth, now in early labor and terrified she would lose her husband in addition to her children and father, pleaded with Sister Constance to do everything possible to save him. The woman's response would later be remembered as particularly chilling by those who eventually uncovered the truth. "My dear child," Sister Constance said, holding Elizabeth's shaking hands, "some illnesses are God's method of summoning his children home. We mustn't challenge his wisdom. Only trust in his compassion. Your husband will join your precious little ones in paradise, and you will raise your newborn, knowing your family awaits you in glory." James Morrison died on the 14th day, just hours before Elizabeth gave birth to a son who would live only long enough to receive baptism from Father Murray. When Elizabeth herself succumbed to the same mysterious illness 3 days later, the entire Morrison family had been eliminated in less than 3 weeks. To any outside observer who might have asked about the family's fate, the Graysons had a completely reasonable explanation. The Morrisons had arrived sick and exhausted from the trail, had contracted a virulent form of dysentery that sometimes struck entire families, and had died despite the best efforts of Christian caregivers who had endangered their own lives to provide comfort in their final hours. Father Murray had given them proper Christian burial in the chapel cemetery, and their possessions had been dedicated to the Lord's work, a polite term for theft that sounded suitably devout. But the Morrison family's disappearance was merely the start. The Graysons had discovered something that would change their existence and terrorize the Oregon Trail for the following 36 years. Murder, when carried out with sufficient planning and religious justification, could be remarkably profitable. The achievement of their first family extermination taught the Graysons valuable lessons that would influence their approach for years ahead. They discovered that isolated families made simpler targets than those journeying in groups, that the gradual onset of arsenic poisoning perfectly replicated common trail ailments, and that their religious standing gave them nearly unlimited credibility with desperate grieving people who needed someone other than God to blame for their suffering. Most significantly, they realized that the Oregon Trail supplied them with an endless stream of victims who wouldn't be reported missing for months, if at all. Unlike established communities where disappearances would be quickly observed and investigated, the trail was full of transient families whose exact whereabouts were unknown to relatives back east. A family that disappeared in Oregon might not be expected to contact loved ones for 6 months or more. And even then, the perils of frontier existence provided countless plausible explanations for their silence. The months after the Morrison murders saw the Graysons improving their operation. With methodical accuracy, they created patterns and procedures that would benefit them throughout the years. Brother Ezekiel became their scout, riding the trail approaches to spot promising targets, families with visible wealth, those traveling alone or in small groups, and particularly those already dealing with illness or mechanical issues that made them susceptible to offers of assistance. Sister Constance refined her poisoning techniques, testing different amounts and delivery approaches to achieve maximum effectiveness while preserving believable denial. She found that arsenic could be readily concealed in herbal teas, medicinal preparations, and even communion wine, making it simple to give to entire families under the pretense of spiritual or medical attention. Father Murray, in the meantime, perfected the psychological control that kept victims cooperative even as their loved ones perished around them. He became skilled at identifying people's denominational backgrounds and adapting his theological approach correspondingly. For Methodist families, he stressed divine healing and the power of prayer. For Presbyterians, he focused on predestination and God's ultimate plan. For Baptists, he emphasized personal salvation and the promise of heavenly reunion. The chapel itself went through subtle alterations to support their murderous operation. The cellar was enlarged and split into sections, one area for storing victims' belongings, another for preparing arsenic solutions, and a third that served as a temporary morgue where bodies could be held while the Graysons determined disposal methods. They also excavated a sequence of unmarked graves in a grove of trees behind the chapel, locations that would eventually contain the remains of hundreds of their victims. The winter of 1852 to 1853 gave the Graysons valuable time to strategize and get ready for the next year's killing season. They used the months when the trail was largely empty to sort through the Morrison family's belongings, choosing what to retain, what to sell, and what to conceal. They also made their initial contact with black market dealers in larger Oregon settlements, forming relationships with men who asked no questions about the origins of the goods they purchased. Brother Ezekiel demonstrated particular skill at this aspect of their operation. His trustworthy face and straightforward manner made him believable when he claimed to be selling possessions on behalf of families who had decided to return east or had died from natural causes. He learned to space out his sales across multiple communities and to target different types of buyers for different categories of goods. Quality furniture and household items went to wealthy settlers looking to improve their homes. Tools and farming gear were sold to practical farmers. Jewelry and precious metals found their way to merchants who specialized in such items. By spring 1853, the Graysons had transformed from novice killers into professional predators with a sophisticated understanding of their trade. They had resolved the practical challenges of victim selection, murder methodology, body disposal, and profit realization. More importantly, they had created a public image that made them virtually beyond suspicion. The spring of 1853 brought renewed trail traffic and fresh opportunities for the Grayson family enterprise. Their second major achievement came in May when they encountered the Hoffman family, German immigrants who spoke limited English and were traveling with a wagon loaded with valuable possessions, including fine woodworking tools, quality fabrics, and a significant amount of gold coins that represented their life savings. The Hoffmans were ideal victims in many respects. Their language barrier made them reliant on the Graysons for communication with other travelers. Their foreign customs made them appear exotic and potentially suspicious to other trail users, and their obvious wealth made them attractive targets. Additionally, their limited English meant they were less likely to understand subtle warnings or to effectively communicate concerns to other travelers. The family's head, Heinrich Hoffman, was a skilled clockmaker who had brought his tools and trade items to start a business in Oregon. His wife, Greta, was pregnant with their fourth child, and their 3 existing children ranged from 6 to 12 years old. When mechanical issues with their wagon compelled them to seek assistance near the Sacred Heart Chapel, the Graysons saw another chance to refine their deadly craft. This time they tested different methods. Instead of waiting for the family to develop natural illness, Sister Constance began giving small doses of arsenic almost immediately, concealed as preventive medicine to ward off trail diseases. She persuaded the family that the blessed protection she offered would maintain their health during their recovery period. "My God," Heinrich said in his broken English when Sister Constance first gave her medicine, "you are so kind to strangers. God will bless you for helping us." "God has already blessed us," Sister Constance answered with practiced sincerity, "by giving us the opportunity to serve his children in their time of need." The Hoffman family's murder took nearly a month to finish, but the extended timeline allowed the Graysons to thoroughly catalogue their possessions and create detailed plans for disposing of the valuable clockmaking tools and trade goods. It also gave them time to study the family's routines and relationships, knowledge that would prove valuable in their future operations. By the end of 1853, the Graysons had successfully murdered 3 complete families totaling 16 people, and they had started to view their operation as a business that required the same careful planning and attention to detail as any other profitable enterprise. They began keeping records, not just of their victims' possessions, but of their methods, their errors, and their achievements. These records, discovered decades later in the chapel's hidden cellar compartments, would eventually give investigators a horrifying window into the systematic nature of the Grayson family's crimes. Written in Father Murray's precise handwriting, the ledgers contained detailed entries for each family they murdered, including names, dates, possessions taken, disposal methods used, and profits realized from selling stolen goods. The entries were written in a cold, businesslike style that treated human lives as inventory items. A typical entry might read, Morrison family, 5 souls departed, September or October 1852. Possessions included 2 gold coins, furniture items, quality tools. Bodies interred in Grove Section C. Estimated profit $400. Method: arsenic via medicinal teas. Duration 17 days. Lessons learned: reduce dose frequency to extend timeline and reduce suspicion. As word of the Graysons' charitable work spread along the trail, they began attracting victims actively seeking their help. Families who had heard about the good Christian folk who provided assistance to travelers would sometimes seek out the Sacred Heart Chapel specifically, walking directly into the trap that the Graysons had so carefully constructed. The Graysons' methodical approach to mass murder evolved significantly during their second year of operation. They had learned from their early experiences that success required not just effective killing techniques, but also sophisticated systems for managing every aspect of their deadly enterprise. Father Murray, with his analytical mind and leadership skills, began treating their operation like a business that happened to involve murder rather than a series of random killings. The summer of 1854 marked a turning point in their methodology when they encountered the Wetherb family from Tennessee. Charles Wetherb was a former Confederate officer who had decided to seek his fortune in Oregon rather than rebuild his war-torn plantation. He traveled with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, aged 15, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith who had brought his complete set of professional tools. What made the Wetherb case significant was not just their wealth, though Charles had converted most of his remaining assets into gold coins and jewelry that he kept hidden in a specially constructed compartment in his wagon, but their intelligence and natural suspicion. Charles had been a military officer, trained to notice details and assess threats. Margaret was an educated woman who had read extensively about trail dangers and was naturally cautious about trusting strangers. When the Wetherb wagon developed wheel problems near the chapel, Charles initially resisted the Graysons' offers of assistance. He had heard stories about travelers who had accepted help from strangers and never been seen again, and something about the isolated location and the convenient timing of Brother Ezekiel's appearance made him uneasy. "I appreciate your Christian charity," Charles told Father Murray during their first meeting, "but we've got the skills and tools to handle our own repairs. We'll be moving on directly." Father Murray, however, had become expert at reading people and adapting his approach accordingly. Rather than pressing the issue, he withdrew gracefully, mentioning casually that Sister Constance had mentioned seeing signs of sickness in the area, possibly cholera or dysentery, and suggesting that the family might want to consider staying until they were certain none of them had been exposed. "Of course, Brother Charles," Murray said with apparent understanding, "a wise man protects his family. But I would feel remiss in my Christian duty if I didn't mention that Sister Constance has been treating several cases of trail fever in the past weeks. The symptoms can take time to manifest, and traveling while infected can spread the disease and weaken the body's defenses." The mention of disease had exactly the effect Murray intended. Margaret Wetherb, already exhausted from months of trail life and worried about her daughter's health, began to reconsider their quick departure. When young David developed a mild fever the next day, a fever that Sister Constance claimed was an early symptom of the regional sickness, the family's resistance crumbled. "Perhaps," Margaret suggested to her husband, "we should accept their offer of shelter just until we're certain David isn't seriously ill." Charles agreed reluctantly, but his military training made him maintain a level of alertness that posed a challenge for the Graysons. Unlike their previous victims who had been desperate and grateful, Charles watched everything with calculating eyes and asked pointed questions about the family's background and the fate of other travelers who had sought their help. The Graysons adapted by providing him with carefully crafted stories about their successful treatment of previous families. They showed him the chapel cemetery, pointing out graves that they claimed belonged to travelers who had arrived already dying and had received proper Christian burial. They even introduced him to testimonial letters, forged documents supposedly written by grateful families who had recovered from serious illnesses and continued safely to their destinations. "Brother Charles," Father Murray said one evening as they sat on the chapel porch, "I understand your caution. A man who has served his country learns to trust carefully. But consider this, if we meant you harm, would we not have acted by now? Would we not choose easier targets than a trained soldier with weapons and watchful eyes?" The psychological manipulation was subtle but effective. By acknowledging Charles's suspicions and military background, Murray made him feel respected and intelligent. By pointing out that he would be a difficult target, the preacher made the idea of being targeted seem less likely. Most importantly, by demonstrating apparent openness and honesty, he gradually lowered Charles's defenses. The actual murders of the Wetherb family took nearly 6 weeks to complete, representing the longest timeline the Graysons had yet attempted. Sister Constance began with extremely small doses of arsenic administered through water that she claimed had been blessed for healing and recommended for preventing the spread of disease. The doses were so small that the symptoms developed very gradually, appearing to be natural illness rather than poisoning. David, the youngest and physically weakest member of the family, succumbed first. His death seemed to confirm Sister Constance's warnings about the regional sickness, and the family's gratitude for her care during his final days made them even more trusting of her medical knowledge. Margaret was next, developing symptoms that Sister Constance attributed to the strain of nursing David through his illness. Charles, trained to analyze battlefield situations, began to notice patterns that disturbed him: the fact that he and his daughters remained healthy while the others grew sick, the peculiar nature of the symptoms, and the Graysons' consistent presence during the worst moments of each family member's illness, all contributed to a growing sense of unease. His suspicions reached a crisis point when he discovered Brother Ezekiel examining the contents of his wagon late one night. When confronted, Ezekiel claimed he had been checking to ensure that their possessions were secure and that wild animals hadn't gotten into their supplies. The explanation was plausible, but Charles's instincts told him otherwise. "Margaret," he said to his dying wife the next morning, "I think we need to leave this place. Something isn't right here." But Margaret was too weak to travel, and moving her would likely have killed her. Charles found himself trapped between his growing suspicions and his love for his family. He couldn't abandon his dying wife, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that staying would doom them all. The resolution came when Charles made a discovery that confirmed his worst fears. While searching for medical supplies in the chapel basement, he stumbled upon a hidden compartment containing possessions that clearly belonged to other travelers, items too personal and too valuable to have been willingly abandoned by their owners. Among the hidden possessions, he found a child's doll that showed signs of recent ownership, a pocket watch engraved with a name he didn't recognize, and most damning of all, a letter addressed to someone in Oregon City that bore a recent date but had obviously never been sent. The letter, written in a woman's handwriting, described arriving safely at a chapel and thanking God for the kindness of the Christian family who was caring for her sick children. Charles realized that he had discovered evidence of previous murders and that his family was being systematically poisoned by the very people who claimed to be saving them. But his realization came too late. Margaret died that night, and he awoke the next morning feeling the familiar symptoms that had preceded each family member's death. What Charles didn't know was that the Graysons had been watching him carefully, had noticed his growing suspicions, and had decided to accelerate his poisoning before he could act on his concerns. Father Murray had slipped a massive dose of arsenic into Charles's evening meal, ensuring that the former soldier would be too weak to pose a threat. As Charles lay dying, his twin daughters at his bedside, he made a desperate attempt to warn them about the Graysons' true nature. But his words were dismissed as the ramblings of a fevered mind, and the girls continued to trust the people who were slowly murdering them. The Wetherb case taught the Graysons several important lessons. First, that intelligent, suspicious victims required more sophisticated manipulation techniques. Second, that extending the murder timeline, while riskier, actually made their crimes more believable and profitable. Third, that they needed better methods for detecting and managing victims who became suspicious of their activities. Most importantly, The case demonstrated that even trained, intelligent people could be successfully deceived and murdered if the right psychological techniques were applied with sufficient patience and skill. This realization gave the Graysons confidence to target increasingly wealthy and prominent families, knowing that their methods could overcome even the most careful and suspicious travelers. The discovery of evidence from previous murders in the chapel basement also led to improvements in their evidence disposal procedures. They began burning personal items that could identify victims, melting down jewelry and precious metals to eliminate identifying marks, and creating more sophisticated hiding places for possessions that they intended to keep or sell later. By the end of 1854, the Graysons had murdered 23 people in 7 families, and their operation had become a sophisticated criminal enterprise that generated substantial profits while maintaining complete secrecy. They had also begun to see themselves not as criminals, but as instruments of divine will who were rewarded for their service by being allowed to prosper from their victims' possessions. The year 1855 marked a crucial turning point in the Graysons' murderous career when they encountered their first major challenge, the survival of an intended victim who had witnessed enough to expose their entire operation. The incident began routinely enough with the arrival of the Patterson family from Ohio, but it would end with the Graysons facing the terrifying possibility of discovery and the need to make desperate choices about their future. Thomas Patterson was a successful merchant who had liquidated his Ohio business to pursue opportunities in Oregon's growing economy. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children aged 8 to 16, and Emily's sister Catherine, an unmarried woman in her 30s who served as the family's teacher and caregiver. What made the Patterson family particularly attractive to the Graysons was not just their obvious wealth. Thomas had converted his business assets into easily transportable gold and banknotes, but also their apparent respectability and the likelihood that their disappearance would eventually be noticed by business associates in both Ohio and Oregon. The family's wagon train had dispersed near the Blue Mountains, and they were traveling alone when they encountered Brother Ezekiel approximately 5 miles from the Sacred Heart Chapel. Their wagon had not broken down, and none of the family members were obviously ill. But Ezekiel had learned to create opportunities rather than simply wait for them to occur. "Good afternoon, brother," Ezekiel called out as he approached the Patterson wagon. "I couldn't help but notice your fine team of oxen. That's quality livestock right there. You folks wouldn't happen to be interested in trading for some fresh supplies, would you? We keep a good stock at the chapel just ahead." Thomas Patterson was a shrewd businessman who had learned to evaluate offers carefully before making decisions. He was interested in the possibility of obtaining fresh supplies, but something about Ezekiel's manner, perhaps too friendly, too eager, made him cautious. "We appreciate the offer," Thomas replied, "but we're well supplied for the remainder of our journey. We'll be moving on directly." Ezekiel, however, had prepared for this response. Of course. But I wonder if I might mention something that could save your family considerable trouble. Sister Constance, that's our medical woman, she's been treating several cases of mountain fever in recent weeks. Nasty business that takes hold gradually, and by the time folks realize they're sick, they're too weak to travel safely. The mention of disease had its intended effect on Emily Patterson, who immediately began worrying about her children's health. "Mountain fever?" she asked. "We haven't heard anything about disease in the area." "Well, Ezekiel said with practiced concern, "it's not something folks like to talk about. Bad for business, if you know what I mean. But Sister Constance, she's got remedies that can prevent it if administered before the symptoms appear. Might be worth your while to stop by the chapel just to have your family examined." Thomas remained skeptical, but Emily's maternal instincts had been activated. The idea that her children might be exposed to a dangerous disease without her knowledge was terrifying, and the possibility of prevention was too valuable to ignore. "Thomas," she said quietly, "perhaps we should at least speak with this medical woman. If there's disease in the area, shouldn't we take precautions?" Reluctantly, Thomas agreed to visit the chapel, telling himself that they would simply get information about the supposed disease and then continue their journey. He had no way of knowing that this decision would lead to the most harrowing experience of his life and the near destruction of his entire family. The Graysons received the Patterson family with their usual combination of Christian warmth and subtle manipulation. Father Marai impressed Thomas with his knowledge of business and his apparent familiarity with commercial conditions in Oregon. Sister Constance charmed Emily with her gentle manner and her obvious affection for children. Brother Ezekiel entertained the Patterson children with stories of frontier life and demonstrations of his various practical skills. Within hours of their arrival, the family had agreed to spend the night at the chapel to allow Sister Constance to examine everyone for signs of mountain fever. The examination revealed, predictably, that several family members showed early symptoms that required immediate treatment with Sister Constance's preventive remedies. Catherine Patterson, Emily's sister, was the first to receive treatment. As an unmarried woman with no children of her own, she had devoted her life to caring for her sister's family and was particularly concerned about the children's health. She eagerly accepted Sister Constance's medicine and encouraged the others to do the same. But Catherine was also the most observant member of the family, and she possessed a naturally analytical mind that made her notice details that others might miss. On the second night of their stay, she observed Brother Ezekiel making what appeared to be a careful inventory of their wagon's contents. When she mentioned this to Sister Constance, the older woman dismissed it as routine concern for their security. Brother Ezekiel checks all our guests' possessions, Sister Constance explained. We've had problems with theft in the past, and we want to ensure that nothing goes missing while families are under our care. The explanation seemed reasonable, but Catherine continued to notice small details that troubled her. The way Father Marai's eyes lingered on Thomas's gold watch, the fact that Sister Constance always prepared her medicines in private, never allowing anyone to observe the process, the peculiar coincidence that every family member who received treatment seemed to develop symptoms that required additional treatment. Catherine's suspicions reached a critical point on the fourth day when she discovered Sister Constance adding a white powder to the medicine intended for young Timothy Patterson, the family's youngest child. When Catherine asked about the powder, Sister Constance claimed it was blessed salt that enhanced the healing properties of the herbs. But Catherine had grown up in Ohio where her father had been a pharmacist, and she recognized the crystalline appearance of the powder as inconsistent with ordinary salt. More importantly, she noticed that Sister Constance became nervous and defensive when questioned about her methods, quite different from the serene confidence she usually displayed. That evening, Catherine made a decision that would save her life and the lives of her surviving family members. Instead of taking her prescribed medicine, she pretended to drink it while actually spitting it into a handkerchief. She also managed to convince young Timothy to do the same, telling him it was a game they could play together. The results were dramatic and terrifying. While Thomas, Emily, and the 3 older children continued to weaken from their treatments, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. More importantly, Catherine began to notice that the sickest family members were those who had been most compliant with Sister Constance's medical regimen. By the 6th day, 2 of the Patterson children had died, and Thomas was clearly dying. Emily, though weak, was still conscious and alert enough to have a conversation with her sister. It was during this conversation that Catherine made the decision to share her suspicions. "Emily," she whispered, "I think these people are poisoning us. I think they're killing our family." Emily's initial reaction was disbelief and anger. The idea that the kind Christian family who had been caring for them could be murderers seemed impossible. But as Catherine explained her observations and the pattern of symptoms, Emily began to see the horrible truth. "What can we do?" Emily asked. "Thomas is dying. The children are dying. And we're too weak to travel." Catherine had been preparing for this question. "We have to get away from here, even if it kills us. Staying here will definitely kill us. And we have to take Timothy. He's the only other one who hasn't been taking the medicine." The escape plan that Catherine devised was desperate and dangerous, but it represented their only chance for survival. She waited until the early hours of the morning when the Graysons were asleep, then helped Emily and Timothy slip out of the cabin. Thomas was too weak to move, and the older children were unconscious, but Catherine made the agonizing decision to leave them behind rather than risk the lives of those who might still be saved. The 3 survivors made their way to the family wagon, where Catherine had hidden some of their gold and essential supplies. But as they were preparing to leave, they heard footsteps approaching from the chapel. Father Marai, apparently alerted by some sound, was coming to investigate. "Quick," Catherine whispered. "Hide in the wagon bed under the canvas. Don't make a sound no matter what happens. Father Marai found Catherine standing beside the wagon, and his reaction confirmed her worst fears. Instead of showing concern for a family member who might be sleepwalking or confused by illness, his expression was cold and calculating. "Sister Catherine," he said quietly, "you should be resting. The mountain fever can cause confusion and poor judgment." "I couldn't sleep," Catherine replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about Thomas and the children." Marai studied her for a long moment, and Catherine realized that he was evaluating whether she had discovered their secret. The tension stretched between them like taut wire, each waiting for the other to reveal their intentions. "Perhaps," Marai said finally, "Sister Constance should prepare a stronger remedy for you, something to help you rest more peacefully." Catherine understood that he was proposing to kill her immediately rather than wait for the gradual poisoning to take effect. "That's very thoughtful," she said. "But I think I'll try to sleep naturally first." "I'm afraid I must insist," Marai replied, and his hand moved to something concealed beneath his coat. What happened next would haunt Catherine Patterson for the rest of her life. As Marai stepped toward her, apparently intending to force her back to the cabin, Emily Patterson emerged from behind the wagon. Despite her weakness from the poison, she had managed to arm herself with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," Emily said, her voice weak but determined. Marai turned toward this new threat, and in that moment of distraction, Catherine grabbed a heavy iron tool from the wagon and struck him in the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it stunned him long enough for the two women and the child to begin their desperate escape. The wagon pulled away from the Sacred Heart Chapel just as Brother Ezekiel emerged from the main building, alerted by the commotion. The last thing Catherine saw as they fled was Ezekiel running toward the cabin where the rest of their family lay dying, probably to finish what the poison had started. The escape journey was a nightmare of fear, exhaustion, and grief. Emily, weakened by weeks of poisoning, could barely remain conscious, leaving Catherine to drive the wagon while caring for Timothy and watching for pursuit. They had no clear idea where they were going, only the desperate knowledge that they had to reach help before the Graysons could catch them or the poison could claim Emily's life. For 3 days, they traveled through unfamiliar territory, following what appeared to be old hunting trails and hoping to encounter other travelers or settlements. Timothy, traumatized by the loss of his family and the terrifying escape, barely spoke. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling for her dead children and husband. On the 4th day, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Dalles, soldiers who were investigating reports of Indian activity in the area. Catherine's story of murder and poisoning at the Sacred Heart Chapel was so extraordinary that the patrol leader initially assumed she was delirious from illness or trauma. But Catherine had brought evidence with her, a vial of Sister Constance's medicine that she had saved, samples of the white powder she had seen being added to the treatments, and several items from their wagon that she had observed Brother Ezekiel.